Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia, by Woody Holton, narrated by Cassandra Campbell. Introduction. Americans tend to think of the Virginia gentry, the colonial elite that gave us Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, as a proud and optimistic ruling class. They do not imagine gentlemen resorting to desperate measures, such as crashing down the gates of prisons or placing weapons in the hands of slaves. But in April 1774, Jacob Haight, one of the wealthiest men in Berkeley County, Virginia, did both of those things and more. The desperation experienced by men like Haight, and to a surprising extent by men like Jefferson and Washington as well, helped drive them into the American Revolution. Since they took Britain's largest American colony with them, anyone interested in the origins of the independence movement needs to understand why they felt so desperate. Haight was the son of a highly successful Shenandoah Valley land speculator, and had hoped to replicate his father's success farther west. In the late 1760s, he and his business partner, Richard Paris, contrived a way to obtain a large tract of land from the Cherokee Indians. Paris had a son, George, by a Cherokee woman. Métis like George Paris were viewed by Cherokee headmen as useful diplomatic bridges to British America, whose interests should be promoted. So when George asked headmen for a 150,000-acre tract just west of South Carolina, they gave it to him. George Paris then sold the land to his father and Jacob Haight. It was a clever scheme, but a British official feared that it might provoke the Cherokees to join an anti-British confederation that Indian diplomats were just then assembling. He persuaded a South Carolina court to void the deal. The revocation of the Cherokee deed left Jacob Haight with no way to pay a 1,600-pound debt to James Hunter, a Scottish trader in Fredericksburg. Hunter, who was feeling pressure from his own creditors in England, sued, won, and in 1773 demanded that the Berkeley County Sheriff Adam Stephen auction off enough of Haight's property to pay the debt. For Haight, Hunter's demand could not have come at a worse time. By the fall of 1773, the price of tobacco had sunk to one of its lowest levels ever. Even in the Shenandoah Valley, where Jacob Haight lived and where little tobacco was grown, the credit market collapsed, and the price of most everything farmers produced and owned plummeted. During that period of cash scarcity and deflation, the liquidation of Haight's debt to Hunter would require the sale of a large portion of his property. He would be ruined. Haight managed to fend off Sheriff Stephen for a year, but on April 12, 1774, the sheriff seized 15 of Haight's slaves and 21 of his horses and took them to Martinsburg, the county seat. He locked the slaves in the county jail and the horses in the jailer's stable, and then he announced an auction. Haight had to think fast. On Thursday morning, April 14th, his son Thomas and a gang of men armed with guns, swords, pistols, and axes advanced on Martinsburg. Sheriff Stephen deputized several men and directed them to guard Jacob Haight's slaves and horses, but Thomas Haight's gang surrounded the jail, overpowered the guards, broke down the doors of the jail and the stable, and seized the slaves and horses. The gang also freed Murty Handley, a smallholder that had been imprisoned for debt, and another person that had been jailed on suspicion of being a runaway servant. The group captured 2 of the prison guards, tied them up, and confined them, along with the slaves, at Jacob Haight's house. Later that day, Haight got word that Sheriff Stephen's posse was about to attack. If the sheriff achieved his purpose of selling Haight's horses and slaves, the worst victims would be the slaves themselves, since their families would probably be divided forever. Recognizing that he and his slaves had a common interest in preventing their sale, and desperately needing more fighters, Height went into the kitchen where his Negroes were and told them to follow up the white men, and upon the first gun that was fired, to rush in with what weapons they had, and to do what they could, but to take care not to hurt their own men, one of Height's white supporters later reported. Height's slaves never got the chance to test their mettle against the sheriff's posse, since its attack was delayed long enough for Height to start them south down the Great Wagon Road toward his illegal settlement in Cherokee country. Along the road, at least some of Height's enslaved workers were captured, and later they were sold at auction. The conflict did not end there. Height sued the men in Sheriff Stevens' posse, and the deputies feared that the jury would side with Height, it being too general a wish among the people to evade the payment of their debts and render the authority of court judgments of none effect. The widespread wish to prevent the enforcement of court judgments against Virginia debtors became a troubling subject of conversation in Williamsburg, the provincial capital, but as it turned out, the wish was soon to be granted. In June 1774, less than 2 months after Height's gang broke open the Berkeley County Jail, Virginia courts began to refuse to try suits brought by creditors against debtors. The courts closed partly to protest Parliament's assault on American liberty, and partly to prevent creditors from depriving debtors such as Height and Handley of their property and freedom. The Height gang's assault on the Berkeley County Jail raises questions about the elite Virginians that led Britain's largest North American colony into the Revolution. Jacob Height clearly was a desperate man. Did a similar sense of desperation overcome other gentlemen on the eve of the Revolution? Our tendency is to answer no. Men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Patrick Henry live in the American memory as the proud exemplars of a supremely confident gentry class. Historians have long assumed it was that very confidence that emboldened Virginia gentlemen to lead their colony, and 12 of her sisters, out of the British Empire. The gentry's self-assurance, we are told, rested on a firm foundation. Gentlemen such as Washington and Jefferson exercised almost unchallenged hegemony over other classes in the province. They had established authority over the poorest 40% of Virginians by enslaving them. Native Americans might slow, but they could not halt the colony's westward advance. Even the gentry's relationship with British merchants, about which Jefferson and others frequently complained, has been presented in modern scholarship as more beneficial to gentlemen than they were willing to admit. Their British friends, for such they called them in their correspondence, marketed their tobacco, filled their invoices by making the rounds of the London tradesmen, and even loaned them money. From that viewpoint, the key to the Virginia gentlemen's secure position at the top of the social pyramid was their remarkably cordial relationship with small farmers. Elsewhere in 18th-century America, in the Hudson Valley with its vast landed estates, in both Carolinas and especially in the great northern seaports, elites often seemed besieged by farmers, tenants, artisans, and sailors. But the Virginia gentleman that consorted with his lower-class neighbors was greeted with deference, historians tell us. The gentry and smallholder classes were unified by their mutual interest in growing tobacco and in controlling slaves and women. Altogether, with the help of his junior partners among the yeomanry, the Virginia gentleman seems to have controlled the movements of Indians, merchants, slaves, and smallholders almost as if they were puppets. Little wonder, then, that the gentleman felt secure enough to take the Old Dominion into the American Revolution. Starting in the 1960s, those two notions, that the gentry was brimming with confidence, and that it was in complete control of its relations with Indians, smallholders, slaves, and even British merchants, were challenged. Some historians found that the gentry's confidence was laced with anxiety. Others have shown that, although the old image of gentlemen exerting enormous influence over those groups was not false, none of them was the gentry's puppet. In fact, each had its own ability to pull strings. One arena in which they powerfully influenced gentlemen was imperial politics. In complex ways, and without intending to, Indians, merchants, and slaves helped drive gentlemen like Jacob Height and smallholders like Murty Handley into the rebellion against Britain. In addition, small farmers exerted direct and deliberate pro-independence pressure upon gentlemen. That particular web of influences helping to push Virginia into the War of Independence is the subject of this work. From 1763 to 1776, Indians, merchants, slaves, and debtors helped propel free Virginians into the independence movement in three distinct ways. First, the Free Virginians' efforts to influence imperial policy were contested by Native Americans, British merchants, and enslaved Virginians. The elimination of the government as an instrument or ally of merchants, Indians, and slaves was one reason for white Virginians to rebel against Britain. Second, free Virginians were attracted to the most important resistance strategy of the pre-war period, the commercial boycott against Britain, because it seemed likely not only to impel Parliament to repeal laws considered oppressive by white Americans, but also to reduce the Virginians' debt to British merchants. Third, the thoroughgoing boycott adopted by the First Continental Congress in October 1774 transformed Virginia's society and economy in unexpected ways. It presented opportunities to enslaved Virginians and put extraordinary pressure upon the colony's small farmers. In responding to those opportunities and pressures, slaves and farmers challenged the authority of the provincial gentry. Those challenges indirectly help induce gentlemen to turn the protests of 1774 into the independence movement of 1776. Who were the members of the pre-revolutionary gentry? And how was the gentry related to other groups within and beyond Virginia? The two questions call forth the same answer, since it was the gentry's relations with Indians, British merchants, slaves, and smallholders that defined it as a class. Satirist James Reed declared in the 1760s that a Virginian qualified as a gentleman as soon as he acquired money, Negroes, and land enough. Other definitions of the gentry would isolate essentially the same people. Gentlemen sat in the House of Burgesses, on the Executive Council, and on the benches of the county courts. Although nearly half of white Virginians owned one or two field slaves, almost all of the domestic slaves, along with most of the brick houses, imported luxuries like books, and the most fertile tidewater lands were owned by members of the gentry. Gentlemen and gentlewomen were the wealthiest 10% of free Virginians. They owned 1/2 of Virginia's property. Most Virginia tobacco growers sold their crops in the colony, but gentlemen consigned theirs to British merchants. Although all of those definitions of the gentry are useful, none is as precise as James Reed's. He knew that what set elite Virginians apart was not simply the amount of property they owned, but also the type. Reed's money, Negroes, and land were essentially the factors of production: capital, labor, and land. Gentlemen struggled for control of each factor against other groups, against British merchants over capital, against agricultural workers, both enslaved and free, over the fruits of their labor, and against Indians over their land. Just as the gentry was defined as a class by its relations with Indians, merchants, and free and enslaved laboring class Virginians, those other groups may be defined in relation to the gentry. Gentry-Indian relations underwent a major transformation after 1750, when free Virginians began to covet the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. That was the fruitful hunting territory of the Upper Ohio nations, principally the Mingos, Shawnees, and Delawares. The Upper Ohioans' most fertile territory beyond the mountains, Kentucky, was also the hunting land of the Cherokees. Although Cherokees and Upper Ohioans disagreed about who owned Kentucky, They agreed that Britain did not. When Virginia land speculators began staking claims to Kentucky, they courted conflicts with settlers, Indians, and British bureaucrats. Another group that came into conflict with the gentry, and with smallholders as well, comprised the tobacco merchants of England and Scotland. By the time of the American Revolution, tobacco growers large and small owed huge debts to the British merchants. During the preceding century, Virginia's per capita debt had nearly doubled. Growers blamed their debts partly on the Navigation Acts, which gave British merchants a monopoly of their trade. Although by the 1760s free Virginians had submitted to the Navigation Acts for more than a century, they deeply resented them, and they resolutely refused to endure any additional burden. When the British government tried to impose just such a new burden, taxes, the Americans were irate. The conflict between Virginia debtors and British merchant creditors aggravated the imperial struggle in another way as well. It was partly to reduce their debts to British merchants that free Virginians participated in the patriotic non-importation and non-exportation associations. The 18th century tobacco trade was complex, and in order to be clear at all times about what type of merchant I am referring to, I make some distinctions between the word merchants and its synonyms that 18th century Virginians would not have recognized. The mercantile firms and transatlantic slave traders in Glasgow, London, and other British ports will be called merchants. The employees of those merchants that were located in the Chesapeake will be denoted storekeepers or factors. Such employees may be distinguished from a third group, independent Virginia entrepreneurs, who shall be designated traders. Another relationship that changed radically in the 18th century was that between slave owners and the people they owned. The enslaved portion of Virginia's population grew from less than 9% at the turn of the century to 40% in 1775, by which time an estimated 186,000 Virginians were black. Natural increase, which had begun by 1730, was good news for slave owners, not only financially, but also because it allowed the House of Burgesses to exclude the workers that were considered most dangerous, newly enslaved Africans, from the province. But if Afro-Virginia demography worked in the slaveholders' favor, British politics did not. When the House of Burgesses tried to impose prohibitive duties on every African brought to Virginia, British merchants persuaded the Privy Council, Britain's executive body, to veto the duties. Where, in other cases, the power that merchants wielded over the London government hurt gentry Virginians financially, here, in combination with the threat that slaves posed, it also endangered their lives. The lure of political independence grew as a consequence. Starting in late 1774, enslaved Virginians did even more to hasten the growth of patriotic sentiment. By drawing the last royal governor into an alliance with them, freedom-seeking Afro-Virginians helped estrange white Virginians from the royal government and prepare them for independence. So far, this summary of political and social relations in pre-revolutionary Virginia has focused on gentlemen and taken note of areas, such as the conflict against enslaved Virginians, where the interests of the gentry converged with those of smallholders. Actually, one of the most important relationships in the colony was that between gentlemen and smallholders. Among an estimated 280,000 white Virginians in 1775, no more than 10% were gentlemen. Perhaps another 10% were artisans, traders, and overseers of slaves. That leaves well over 200,000 people in the yeomanry. Small farmers came under tremendous pressure in 1775, when the non-exportation provisions of the Continental Association deprived them of their export income and non-importation subjected them to severe shortages. Those pressures drew forth an agrarian response that, in complex ways, attributed to the gentry's decision to make a formal declaration of independence. Here, another descriptive distinction needs to be made. 18th-century Virginians sometimes applied the term planters to small-scale tobacco growers. At other times, it meant everyone that grew tobacco, including gentlemen. By the middle of the 19th century, census takers would introduce yet another definition of planters. They were people that owned 20 or more slaves. In order to avoid all that confusion, this book eschews the term planters altogether. Instead, gentlemen will be distinguished from small farmers, also smallholders. On many of the issues discussed here, the interests of smallholders were similar to those of long-term tenants, so for brevity's sake, smallholders must be stretched to include both groups. On occasions, when the interest of tobacco-growing smallholders and gentlemen converged, I will refer to the two groups together as tobacco growers. Since this work argues that non-elites powerfully influenced revolutionary politics, the listener may well ask how it is possible to know very much about those people when the majority of them could not write, and the few that could left few records. I did not find using gentry sources to study non-gentlemen as difficult as I had feared, for it quickly became obvious that gentlemen were very interested in the actions of Indians, slaves, and smallholders, as well as British merchants, who left plenty of records of their own. To cite only one example, even in July 1776, Landon Carter showed less interest in imperial affairs than in recovering a group of slaves that had escaped his custody. To be sure, non-elites often deceived elites, and elites' biases often distorted their reporting. But if used with care, top-down sources can in fact be effectively used for bottom-up history. It seems wise to underscore at the outset that this book is rather narrowly focused. Although I suspect that elite patriots and other colonies were influenced by non-elites, just as much as Virginia gentlemen were, this work is only about the Old Dominion. It is not a comprehensive social history of pre-revolutionary Virginia, but a study of some, not all, of the causes, not the effects, of Virginia's revolution. The story told here reveals that when Virginia gentlemen launched their struggle to preserve and extend their freedom, they were powerfully influenced by other freedom struggles, movements put together by Indians, debtors, merchants, slaves, and smallholders. Part 1. Grievances, 1763 to 1774. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. Declaration of Independence. 1. Land speculators versus Indians and the Privy Council. During the winter of 1768 to 1769, Thomas Jefferson set about obtaining government patents for 7,000 acres of land to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. Jefferson actually had no plans to move west. About the time of his birth, in 1743, however, a wave of westward expansion had breached the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia and joined another wave sweeping south along the Shenandoah Valley from Pennsylvania. By 1769, frontier families were already moving west of the Appalachians. Jefferson knew that as soon as he could obtain his land patents and divide them into farmsteads of about 200 acres each, he would find numerous customers for them. Jefferson's hunger for Western wealth was shared by other Virginia gentlemen. George Washington recognized that the greatest estates we have in this colony were made by taking up and purchasing at very low rates the rich backlands, which were thought nothing of in those days, but are now the most valuable lands we possess. Washington gazed with equal parts envy and admiration toward the Shenandoah Valley, where the Heights and other first takers up of those lands had made fortunes. The ability of gentlemen such as Jefferson and Washington to profit from the sale of Western land depended not only upon their entrepreneurial skills, but also upon their political influence. In October 1768, shortly before Jefferson began applying for his Western grants, the Cherokee Indians negotiated a treaty with the British government, in which they retained every acre that Jefferson claimed. The agreement, known as the Treaty of Hard Labor, also interfered with Washington's land speculation, so it was evidently with some enthusiasm that the owners of Mount Vernon and Monticello joined every other member of the Virginia House of Burgesses in asking the imperial government to revoke it. The Burgesses' petition, adopted in December 1769, asked London's permission for Virginia to annex Kentucky and all of the land north to the mouth of the Kanawha River. The government's response to the Burgesses' petition would powerfully influence the financial standings of gentlemen like Jefferson and Washington. Ultimately, it would also affect their allegiance to Britain. The fate of the House of Burgesses' petition rested with British officials, whose visions of the West incorporated the Indians that lived there. In the 1760s, Kentucky was the principal hunting ground, both for the Cherokees, about 7,200 people, and for the upper Ohio Valley nations, the Mingos, 600, Shawnees, 1,800, and Delawares, 3,500. As one Cherokee put it in 1775, Indians looked upon their cattle or game in Kentucky to be as beneficial to them as the tame cattle were to the white people. Peltry was vital to these nations not only in itself but also as a cash crop, for they imported a higher percentage of their clothing and tools than many backcountry whites. Indeed, long before Europeans arrived in North America, hunters there had known that they could rise in status by achieving success as traders. After America's commercial network was linked to Europe's, successful trading became increasingly important to Indian men's identity. One Cherokee, Old Hop, told a visiting European that a fresh supply of red cloth would enable him to appear like a man. The reason that the Indians' desire to preserve their Kentucky hunting territory attracted the attention of imperial officials in London was not that officials felt any moral obligation to the Indians, nor even that they were determined to maintain the flow of deerskins into British ports. What did worry statesmen in the mother country was the likelihood that, if Virginians occupied Kentucky, Indians would attack them, and the British army might have to come to the rescue at great cost to the imperial treasury. The danger was not imaginary. Upon learning of the Burgesses' bid for Kentucky, the British agent that had negotiated the hard labor treaty recalled that a 1763 Indian attack, inappropriately termed Pontiac's Rebellion, had proved expensive and destructive to His Majesty's subjects and to his government. Because the government was so determined to prevent another uprising, the natives' effort to preserve their Kentucky hunting territory helped to produce an imperial land policy that protected their interests but at the same time poisoned the relationship between Virginia gentlemen and the government of Britain. 1. 6.5 years before the House of Burgesses drew up its petition for Kentucky, Indians had signaled their determination to defend their land. As Virginian Peter Fontaine reported in August 1763, warriors of the upper Ohio Valley, Wabash River, and Great Lakes nations entered into a combination against us, resolved, it seems, to prevent our settling any farther than we have, viz. Much about the main Blue Ridge of mountains. Thus, participants in Pontiac's Rebellion raided 12 British forts and numerous settlements as far east as Winchester, Virginia. At the time of the uprising, royal officials in London were already studying a proposal to confine Britain's North American colonies behind a western boundary. They had two principal goals. One was to keep the colonists within Britain's economic and political orbit, the other to halt colonial encroachments on Indian land in order to prevent a costly Anglo-Indian war. The boundary idea came too late to prevent the uprising, but carried...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?